Hello and welcome back into our notes. This is the sixth and final section of notes on imperialism, and today we're really looking at how it affects the Far East, eastern regions of Asia with China and Japan, and what it looks like in these two locations. So one of the things that hopefully you're seeing a similar picture moving forward is the fact that imperialism isn't the start of history for these locations. In fact, China has one of the most expansive histories of all time when we look at nation states or countries, that it goes back, they have over 2,000 years of history. China was also extremely self-sufficient during this time period, okay? And what I mean by that is they have what they need. They have staple crops such as rice. They have cash crops like cotton and silk. And they also have metals, tin, silver, iron. They have manufacturing industry. They have mining industry. What I'm getting at here is that they really did not need to interact with the West. There was no need to trade with Europe. They had everything they needed, and there was no reason to trade things to the Europeans. Now, Britain is really after trade in China specifically. Why? They want Chinese products, specifically tea. And the problem is that, again, the Chinese are self-sufficient. There's no reason they need to trade. They have nothing, or the British, have nothing that they want. So what do? Well, Britain decides that in their other colonies, they have this crop called opium. Right? Opium is the natural substance in a lot of addictive, highly addictive drugs such as heroin, fentanyl, any sort of prescription opiate such as morphine or any sort of like oxycodone product. Okay, they're extremely addictive and they're extremely debilitating as a narcotic. Okay, well, Britain decides that they're going to just start illegally selling this, okay? And over the course of about 10 years, they're successful in addicting over 1 million Chinese nationals. Right? And again, these type of opium-based drugs, okay, are very addictive. So what happens? Well, it causes a lot of demand for the product, okay? That because the Chinese are addicted, they need to keep buying the drug to fulfill that addiction, and trade booms for the British. China's emperor at the time realizes how devastating this is to the people of China and ends up writing a letter to Queen Victoria, the monarch of Great Britain at the time, saying, please stop selling opium to our people. Okay? Again, it is a poisonous drug, okay, that it should be strictly forbidden, as it is in Great Britain, okay, because of the dangers that it has caused. Britain refuses, and they say, you know what, we're not going to stop. In fact, we are going to double down. Okay? We are going to go to war with you over this, because if you try to stop our ships from going into port and exporting this product to you, there's going to be military consequences. China tries to stop ships from entering into Chinese harbors, and they are unsuccessful, mainly because their military equipment was outdated in comparison to the British. What happens is we have the Treaty of Nanjing, which is signed in 1842, that basically after the British beat the Chinese into submission through several naval battles, it increases foreign power over China. It also forces the city of Hong Kong, which is a very important trade hub as it is today, they are forced to give it to Great Britain. I want you to watch this video clip here. I think this is a really good clip from Vice News discussing, okay, how the Chinese got hooked on opium.
We arrest drug dealers. We criminalize people, mainly black and brown people, for possessing small amounts of drugs like weed. We do this because drugs are bad. Unless, of course, it's your government that's dealing the drugs. Like that time, the British Empire got China hooked on opium.
Empires of Dirt, a show about Europeans getting rich at the expense of everyone else.
Opium had been grown in China since the 11th century, but it was only until the 17th century that usage really took off, when people realized you could smoke it instead of just chewing it. By the 1800s, there were foggy back alley opium dens in the streets of Canton, now known as Guangzhou, Shanghai, and even in London's Limehouse on Pennyfield Street. In the early 19th century, Chinese exports like silk, ceramic, and tea were hugely popular in Britain. Opium was one of the few things that British Empire could trade back. It's estimated that as many as 15 million people were addicted to opium by 1890, making it one of the worst cases of national drug addiction ever seen. They would ship opium grown in colonial India to Canton, where Chinese traders would take it into China. As opium grew in popularity, British trade increased. In 1800, 300 metric tons of opium was shipped into China. 4 decades later, this had increased to 3,500 metric tons of opium. Opium was a highly addictive drug with similar effects to modern-day heroin. Long-term users could experience liver, kidney, and heart problems and could die of withdrawal. Opium use had been banned by the Chinese Emperor Yongzheng in 1729 after he saw the effects of addiction on his citizens, and again in 1796 by the Emperor Jiaqing after everyone ignored the first ban. But Britain continued smuggling opium into China. It was simply too profitable not to. The opium monopoly out of India was worth £981,000 in 1831. That's the equivalent of about £100 million today. By the 1830s, people from every level of Chinese society were hooked on opium. After Emperor Daoguang received reports of mass addiction all over the country, he'd had enough. Soldiers burned all the opium they found. British traders lost 20,000 chests of opium, equivalent to about £2 million. This led to the First Opium War in 1839. The British were so angry that their drugs had been stolen that they sent troops to the region to demand economic reparations for the financial losses they'd incurred while illegally trafficking narcotics into a foreign country. They were also angry that China refused to open up more ports to British trade and had disrespected their traders. Back in the UK, the press depicted the Chinese as barbarians who had insulted the honor of Brits abroad. In an act of war, Britain occupied Hong Kong, then a sparsely inhabited island off the southeast coast of China. In 1841, China ceded the island to Britain. A year later, the Treaty of Nanking was signed, marking an end to the First Opium War. So Britain got what it wanted: money for illegally trafficking drugs into China and a shiny new island base to smuggle opium from, Hong Kong. Opium remained illegal after the war, but the Chinese authorities were basically forced to accept the drug trade into China. Opium consumption ripped through Chinese society like never before. Chinese smugglers quickly realized that if they registered their ships in Hong Kong as British ships, they could keep smuggling opium into China. This triggered the Second Opium War in 1856, when a Chinese ship flying the Union Jack was seized by the authorities. The Chinese crew was arrested and the British flag was torn down. The British Navy, supported by the French troops, retaliated by seizing Beijing and looting and burning down the Imperial Summer Palace. China was forced to legalize the import of opium. With the opium trade finally legal, imports from British-controlled India nearly tripled to hit 6,500 metric tons in 1880. Fed up with the British running drugs into their country, the Chinese authorities decided that if you couldn't beat them, you might as well join them. By around 1915, moral and political opposition to the drug trade had grown. Britain stopped importing opium to China. It simply wasn't profitable anymore. It's hard to quantify the scale of the misery that Britain caused in China, or the mess they left behind. And I know personally because my own great-grandfather was addicted to opium and eventually died of withdrawal in Hong Kong. And it's something my family still talks about all the time. The British Empire were one of the biggest drug pushers in history, but hardly anyone in the UK knows what we did in China. Pablo Escobar? he's got nothing on the British Empire.
So again, coming back to the notes from that video, you can see, okay, foreigners are able to gain power in China, okay, through what is pretty underhanded with the opium trade. China is starting to have lots of internal issues. And this becomes the main way that foreign nations are able to take advantage of what's going on in China. They take advantage in a couple of ways. One of the ways that we see is that they gain power through extraterritorial rights. And this is this concept that at Chinese ports, so these big cities along the coast, they don't have to follow Chinese law. So they can kind of do what they would like, which means that foreigners are almost above the law in these Chinese trading cities. We also see this concept of spheres of influence. And this is a very loose but still powerful form of imperialism. Foreign countries basically would claim areas within China, and they were able to hold on to these areas to control trade. Okay? Again, China was not in control. Okay? European countries, the British, the French, the Germans, the Japanese have a little bit of territory as well, including the Russians as well in this entire process. The interaction basically sours the Chinese on these Western empires. Okay? Why? Mainly because of how they're being taken advantage from, and they also start to become upset with the Chinese empress who is in charge at this point in time because she is seen as weak. So right around the turn of the century, what we see is that people are starting to get fed up with what's going on in China. They feel that China has become too weak, that the foreigners have too much control over their country, and for all intents and purposes, they are correct. Okay? And what we see is that a lot of Chinese peasants start to have this anger and hatred towards foreigners. Why? Because they have special privileges in these port cities, okay? And they have preferential treatment in a lot of regards because of these spheres of influence. So secretly, there's a secret society formed called the Boxers. And the Boxers decide to have an uprising. Okay, and they surround these European sections of Beijing and they start shouting, death to the foreign devils. And they keep the city and that particular part of the capital under siege for a couple of months. Overall, the rebellion fails. After a couple of months, it's put down. But one of the things that's important is that this is kind of one of those signposts that we're seeing increased nationalism within China. That people are seeing themselves as Chinese as a nationality and want to, again, just like we talked about with Africa or with India, there is a desire to have freedom of choice in what their path or future moving forward looks like. And the Empress is going to make some reforms to strengthen China moving forward. Now, this is mainly a focus on China, but we also see Japan in this region. And Japan is a little bit different. Why? Japan practiced isolationism. For a very long period of time, Japan basically does not have contact with other countries, that it was not something they wanted to take part in. Prior to this point, the Dutch had a little bit of influence down in the city of Nagasaki, but for the most part, the Japanese try to keep any sort of foreigners out of their territory. The Europeans in the United States, they didn't like this, though. They wanted Japan open, and they wanted their ports so that they could trade things to the Japanese. And by the 1850s, we see that Japan is essentially forced. Not necessarily by the Europeans, but by America. That America is able, basically through what's called gunboat diplomacy, we see this pressure that's put on by Admiral Perry to open up the ports in Japan. If not, there would be war. And this, moving forward, right, is going to be enough to open up Japan. As a result of Japan seeing that they were weak in this regard and they really couldn't stop the Europeans and the Americans, these Western nations, from opening up Japan, they decide to send diplomats out to study these Western countries and to bring back ideas, basically to make Japan stronger. So they start borrowing these ideas from other countries. So Europe, they start looking at industrialization. Germany, in particular, they like the discipline of the German army. They look at the British, in particular, with their navy. And even they look at the United States and social programs like educating everyone. And Japan is different. Again, they, unlike the other examples that we've seen with imperialism, Japan basically goes with the mindset of, if you can't beat them, join them. And they become so modern, they industrialize, they themselves become an imperial power. And they ruthlessly start taking other portions of Asia over into their own empire. So thank you for watching our notes for today. That is all I've got.